Hi, Michelle Glass here. Welcome to our first episode in our Chapter 13, Lecture 13 series. And our topic for this video is just a quick introduction to the spinal cord anatomy. Now, luckily, you are learning this also in your lab component of class. So this should be a little bit either of a refresh from what you've already covered in lab, or maybe this will be a little bit of a preview before you get to it in your lab. So let's get started. All right, so when we're looking at the spinal cord, it's of course embedded in the vertebral column, in those vertebral foramen. And you have four distinct regions. So you have the cervical region, which is talking about the neck area, of course, and then the thoracic region, which is going to be in the vertebrae of the thoracic cavity, and then you have the lumbar region and the sacral region. Now, we also have some distinct features. So one thing to pay attention to is in the adult, the vertebral column is longer than the spinal cord. So it does come to a point. That end of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris, and it's ending between vertebrae L1 and L2. So it's significantly shorter than our entire vertebral column. You have in the cervical region an enlarged area, which is aptly named the cervical enlargement, and this is going to have lots of those neuron cell bodies for the nerves that go to the shoulder and the upper limbs. And then we have a corresponding lumbosacral enlargement, which is going to be housing the neurons that will innervate the pelvis and the lower limbs. Now notice, in the adult, the lumbar region and the lumbosacral enlargement will actually be up in the thoracic portion of the vertebral column. So again, because our spinal cord as adults is much shorter than our vertebral column, we'll see that the lumbar region of the spinal cord is not in the lumbar region of the vertebral column. So pay attention to that in the artwork from your textbook or from lab instruction. You will see 31 pair of spinal nerves, and so of course they're coming off the left and the right sides of the spinal cord. We do name these just like you're naming your vertebrae. So we're going to have cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal nerves. And so we can abbreviate the cervical spinal nerves as C1, and we actually have C1 to C8. So there are 8 pair of cervical spinal nerves. If you recall, there were only 7 cervical vertebrae. So what we're seeing here is you have a pair that comes off above C1 and below C1, and that is the reason for having this kind of extra pair of nerves in this region. Then we have a 12 pair of thoracic nerves, so you have T1 to T12, 5 pair of lumbar nerves, L1 to L5. You will have 5 coming off of the sacral region, so these are called the sacral nerves, S1 to S5. And then you have 1 pair coming off the coccyx region, and this is called the coccygeal nerve. All of these spinal nerves are extending all the way through the vertebral foramen of the vertebrae, through the lumbar and sacral regions, even though the spinal cord itself is not that long. And so that bundle of nerves, as well as some ligaments that anchor the spinal cord, is referred to as the cauda equina, which translates to horsetail. Because it kind of looks like a ponytail or horsetail, and so that's how we're getting that name there. Okay, the next thing that we want to look at is our cross-section of our spinal cord. So I'm going to be using this particular diagram and labeling lots of different regions. So you might want to replicate this in your notes. You might want to make it maybe the size of your piece of paper so you have plenty of space to do your labels. So if you need to pause, go ahead. All right, let's start with all of that gray colored tissue in the center. So if you didn't already, you might want to shade it in with your pencil so that you can see that it is gray in color. This is gray also in a dissection. The gray matter is gray because it has lots of cell bodies. And if you remember, cell bodies of neurons contain what we refer to as nacelle bodies. Those were those collections of ribosomes and rough ER that actually make the cell body gray. And when you have a bunch of those, then all the tissue looks gray, hence the name. But remember, the kind of job of your neuron cell body is to process information. So just think of your gray matter as processing tissue in the spinal cord. And then all of the white tissue on the outside is referred to as white matter. It is white in color because it is consisting primarily of myelinated axons. That myelination is going to give the axon that white color. Remember, axons are essentially transmitting information from one cell to the next. We have information traveling from the body, gets into the spinal cord and goes up to the central nervous system, meaning the brain. And so if it's traveling up to the brain, then that is an ascending pathway. And then we'll see information from the brain coming down the spinal cord and then going out to the body. So if it's coming down from the brain, we're going to talk about that as a descending pathway. The other thing that we can pay attention to here is we do need to be able to, in cross-section, identify the back and the front of the spinal cord. So you can see at the back, you have what's referred to as the posterior, so that means the back, median sulcus. This is going to contain blood vessels from the meningeal layer called the pia mater. And then at the front, you have the anterior median fissure. Now you can recognize in cross-section the difference between the sulcus and the fissure because the sulcus is shallow, whereas the term fissure describes a depression that is deep, a deep depression. You might remember fissure is front and the sulcus is shallow to help you remember which is which. Now this is important because we're going to be naming other parts of the spinal cord based on whether it's anterior or posterior. So we definitely need our orientation here. Notice in the very center of the spinal cord, there's been this black dot. That black dot is representing a canal. So that's an entire passageway through the middle of the spinal cord. It is called the central canal, and it will be containing a special type of fluid called the Cerebrospinal Fluid, which is abbreviated CSF for short. So in later presentations, we'll just talk about the CSF, which is standing for Cerebrospinal Fluid. Now this fluid is important. It's doing jobs very much like the synovial fluid that we talked about in our Lecture 9 series. Cerebrospinal fluid is going to be acting as a shock absorber for neural tissue, as well as transporting oxygen, carbon dioxide gas, nutrients, hormones, and waste products. So instead of having blood vessels penetrating our spinal cord and compromising the amount of neural tissue that we have here, we instead have this CSF fluid running through the center, and then we'll also see it surrounding the outside of the spinal cord. So in addition to doing all the transport that we expect from our blood supply, we're getting this additional shock absorption and buoyancy to our entire central nervous system. So we'll see it in both the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, looking at that white matter, we are going to divide it up into what are described as columns, and we'll see this both on the left and the right side, but to simplify my diagram, I'm just labeling one side. So I'm going to have at the front my anterior white column, at the side my lateral white column, and at the back my posterior white column. Now columns by definition contain tracks. Tracks by definition are bundles of axons that transmit the same type of information at about the same speed and the same direction. So when we talk about direction, we already talked about information from the body is going to ascend up to the brain. Information from the brain will descend down the spinal cord, and then, of course, out to the body. So whether it's ascending or descending is what we're talking about in terms of direction. The speed is, of course, the rate at which that information is transmitted. And when we talk about the same type, we're talking about, oh, it might be sensory information or motor information. If it's sensory, maybe it's pain and temperature together, or maybe it's touch and vibration information. So we'll be talking about this more in the future. Okay, so again, when we're talking about direction, we're talking about ascending. If information is coming from the body and moving up to the brain, then that will be classified as sensory information, whereas your descending information will be those directions from the brain, and so that would be motor information. We also have what is called the white commissure. Now, you might see in your textbook the anterior and the posterior white commissure, so we can be even more specific than that. Notice this word commissure is, to me, kind of strange. It's got 2 M's and 2 S's, so I always kind of say that to myself. You guys know I'm not great with spelling, and so that helps me to practice that. The white commissure is important because it's going to be how information will cross from the left side of the spinal cord to the right side of the spinal cord and vice versa. Now, this is significant because what we will see is the left brain is controlling the right side of the body and interpreting sensory information from the right side of the body. So if that's the case, at some point information has to cross from one side to the other, and that can happen here at the white commissure. Okay, let's zoom in on that gray matter a little bit more, and let's name those projections that we have sticking out there. So we're going to have a projection in the front called an anterior gray horn, projection at the side called a lateral gray horn, and then, of course, at the back we would have the posterior gray horn. Now remember, our gray matter contains cell bodies which are involved in processing. When we're talking about those collections of cells that process the same kind of information, we talk about it as a nuclei. So your anterior, lateral, and posterior gray horns contain processing centers referred to as nuclei. Now, they're going to be processing the same kind of information. So we're going to have sensory nuclei and motor nuclei. Now notice that the sensory nuclei will be housed at the back in the posterior gray horn. So sensory information comes into the back of the spinal cord. And then motor nuclei will be housed in the anterior and lateral gray horns. And so motor information is leaving the spinal cord from the front of the spinal cord. When we talk about sensory nuclei, we're going to see that there are visceral sensory nuclei and somatic sensory nuclei, both of which are housed in the posterior gray horn. Remember, this term visceral is like referring to guts. So this is going to be sensory information from the innards, from the inside of the body. So things about blood pressure and oxygen saturation and pH and movements in the digestive tract, that kind of stuff. Somatic sensory nuclei would be the things that you're consciously aware of. So this is information like touch and pressure and pain and temperature. You are also going to have visceral and somatic motor nuclei, okay? Your visceral motor nuclei are located in the lateral gray horns, while your somatic motor nuclei are going to be in the anterior gray horns. These somatic motor nuclei are going to be controlling the skeletal muscle, so the things like the movements that you're consciously doing here, whereas your visceral motor nuclei would be controlling your smooth muscle and your cardiac muscle. You also have what's referred to as the gray commissure. So again, that word, 2 M's, 2 S's, is having the same function here that we saw for the white commissure, except it's connecting the gray matter. So again, it's connecting the gray matter, the left side, to the right side. So information is crossing here. Okay, and then the final thing that we need to see is what's referred to as your roots. And so you're going to have at the back of the spinal cord what is referred to as a posterior root. Notice that it has a bulge there, so make sure you're drawing that in. And then at the front, you have an anterior root. And notice then that the posterior roots and the anterior roots come together to form our spinal nerve. So the spinal nerve will be consisting of components from the posterior root and the anterior root coming together. Now we talked about that posterior root containing a bulge, and that bulge is called the spinal ganglion. That is the singular version of the word. Ganglia is plural. Ganglia are collections of cell bodies, so again, processing centers located in the PNS, which is standing for the peripheral nervous system. So we'll see this term used here this semester as well as next semester. So make sure you're dedicating that to memory. Okay. The other thing to note is in the past, and you might still see it in some diagrams, the posterior root has also been referred to as the dorsal root. And so the spinal ganglion has also been called the dorsal root ganglion. So you might see those as synonyms, and that's okay. And then the anterior root has also been referred to as the ventral root. So you might see that used, and I might accidentally slip up and call it that from time to time. Okay, so that's it for now. Stay tuned for more.